Today, June 22nd at 4 a.m., without any declaration of war, German troops attacked our country.
Most likely you've heard this recording, and in reality, you were lied to. The Soviet Union knew about the attack. British intelligence had warned them, German high-ranking officers had hinted at it, and Soviet spies reported it. But Stalin didn't believe it. To him, Hitler was an ally. And even if he had betrayed them, the USSR was supposed to be saved by the largest defensive line in the world, one that had been under construction for 11 years. The Stalin Line stretched for approximately 1,800 kilometers. There were hundreds of bunkers like this one. When Europe heard about the Soviet Union's plans, they laughed and assumed it was just disinformation. They thought the Soviets couldn't possibly have that much money. So why did a line that would now cost billions fail to hold back the Germans? Or was it that Stalin built this kind of facade, not for defense, but as a new base for launching an attack on Europe? In this video, you'll learn everything about the largest defensive line in the world. Was the Soviet dictator preparing to attack Germany? You'll see Stalin's unique bunker built into the rock, the same one that the Russians recently dropped 2 bombs on, and find out which Ukrainian president was too afraid to go down there. But before we get started, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. We worked hard to make it the best quality for you. The Stalin Line is classic Soviet thinking. Whatever you build, it has to be the biggest in the world. To explore even a small section of the line took me months. It practically spans from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea. It's not a continuous wall. As I mentioned, it's not like the wall in Game of Thrones or the Great Wall of China. Instead, it's made up of individual pillboxes and bunkers scattered along the front, stretching about 1,800 kilometers. At the time, it was a modern defensive line. What's more, even in 2022, our forces used similar pillboxes. They found them, brought them back into service, and used them. They're not as visually impressive as classic forts. I've done a video on the Terracotta Fortress. It looks amazing, but with the arrival of artillery, those big forts became easy to smash from a distance or to encircle, and without logistics, they turned into massive mass graves. The new defensive lines are basically the same fort dismantled into many small parts and stretched out along a line, harder to hit, easier to bypass, and only individual elements can realistically be surrounded. From the road, we didn't even notice it. This is a standard bunker on the Stalin Line. There were hundreds of them here, a small one, hidden in the forest. Let me show you what's inside. Right away, I'll warn you, space is very limited. First, you're met by a narrow corridor with solid metal above that still holds strong. The doors, as always, are metal, though they've been cut out in most places. We picked just the perfect weather for this. It's about -10 outside. Down here, though, it's noticeably warmer, but there's a draft and a lot of dampness. This area is interesting. Here's the firing position covering the left flank, and this one covers the center. It's all extremely basic, and with many people, there's hardly room to move. The exact same kind of position is over here, covering the right flank. And while I said there's not much space, in reality, there's also a basement. Stairs leading down to a lower level. And honestly, it feels like someone was living here not too long ago. What I'm telling you about now is a line that, technically, never really existed. Because in official documents, there was no such thing as the Stalin Line. It's basically a clickbait term that's almost 90 years old. Back in 1936, a Latvian newspaper used that phrase in a headline, mentioning some kind of Stalin Line. The name caught on with the British and later with the Germans, and that's why we still use it today. But in Soviet documents, it was called something completely different. There's another well-known name, and it comes from here, the city of Korosten in the Zhytomyr region. Two mysterious stories intertwine in this place. The first is Soviet, one of the most heavily fortified bunkers in Ukraine. The second goes back to the times of the princes. It sounds almost like a ready-made script for a TV series, but this is our real history. The history of Korosten could easily compete, for example, with Game of Thrones. This is Prince Mal. He ruled everything here. Ihor came to him a second time asking for tribute that had already been paid, and Mal could not stand it. He tied him to the tops of two trees that had been bent down and released them, a cruel method. On Ihor's wife Olga took revenge. You probably heard about this story in school. She gathered pigeons from the local residents, tied brushwood to them, set it on fire, and they flew to the settlement and basically burned everything down. But despite this, her monument still stands in the city at the same level as Mal's. Over there, a little further, on the other bank, there is also an interesting monument to Dobrynya Nikitic. Russian propaganda works so well that many Ukrainians still think that he was a Russian bogatyr and not a Ukrainian one. Of course, probably everyone has seen the painting Bogatirs by the Russian artist Vasnetsov. It depicts Russian bogatirs. This is Dobrynya Nikitic, Ilya Muromets, and Alyosha Popovich. Moscow, for some reason, considers them their own, but Nikitic actually comes from Korosten. And the other two are bogatirs from the times of Kievan Rus. First of all, they could not possibly have met because they simply lived in different centuries. And there is another interesting detail about how the artist painted them. He portrayed the image of Dobrynya from himself and Popovich from the son of the person who commissioned the painting. And now to the Soviet history. In Korosten, there is a unique site, a rock bunker carved directly into granite. It is often called Stalin's bunker. But did the dictator ever actually come here? In fact, there are many myths about the places the dictator visited. Probably the most interesting one is the claim that Hitler and Stalin met in Ukraine, supposedly in Lviv in 1939. But no document exists. All of Stalin's meetings were documented, and on that date it is noted that he was in the Kremlin. However, for example, on their birthdays, the dictators did congratulate each other.
Here is documentary confirmation and diplomatic protocols from when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. At that time, Hitler did not come. Ribbentrop came to Moscow and Molotov went to Berlin. So, as for a meeting, I believe that this is a great lie about the two dictators ever meeting.
Were they afraid of each other, or were they simply afraid to leave their own places of residence?
Well, I think it was more like keeping a distance, because it is impossible to imagine how such a meeting would have taken place. That's the point. They kept their distance.
If no one has ever seen documents confirming a meeting between Stalin and Hitler, then the Tehran Conference, where the Soviet leader, Churchill and Roosevelt met for the first time, is an indisputable fact. By the way, this was the first time Stalin was forced to use an airplane, and he was very afraid of flying. At the very least, this is shown by the fact that Stalin flew to the Tehran Conference on an American plane, and he was escorted by 27 fighter aircraft. There are a huge number of myths about how many languages Stalin knew, and honestly, I never really understood how well, or even if he knew English at all. Of course, there were interpreters at the negotiations, but certain nuances could still be lost through translation. And this is not surprising, because during World War II, there were cases when British and American soldiers could not understand each other. They even had to issue a special dictionary of military terminology to solve this communication problem.
To keep the site's name secret, they simply called it Warehouse Number 100. Command posts were never meant to be advertised, so the name had to be completely neutral, something that wouldn't attract any attention at all.
There's a lot of information online calling this place not the Rock Bunker, but Stalin's bunker. Did Stalin actually have anything to do with it?
This name isn't official either. It was the Germans who came up with Stalin Line in their documents. Whenever they came across bunkers that didn't look like ordinary small command posts, they would automatically label them Stalin's bunker. In reality, it's more of a popular nickname. Stalin did have his own personal bunker, but it was in the city of Peichev, and he never once left it. These bunkers here were what you'd call army-type facilities. At most, a commander of a rifle corps would be stationed there. 2 of these were built in Ukraine, one in Vinnytsia, which covered the so-called southern direction, and this one, which was responsible for the southwestern front. Construction dates back to 1933, long before Germany had any real military power. At that time, the Soviet Union saw Poland as its most aggressive neighbor. According to official documents, these bunkers were built not so much for defense as for preparing the spread of the socialist revolution. Essentially, expansion into Europe, including Germany and surrounding territories. So their main purpose was to serve as command posts for a future offensive, not as defensive strongholds. We now know from surviving records that the fortifications, these concrete pillboxes, were never designed as a continuous, impenetrable line. They left massive gaps, sometimes 20 kilometers wide. If you're building a true defensive wall, why would you leave such openings? It was, as we'd call it today, psychological warfare or disinformation. The Soviets wanted to showcase that they were building defenses. The bunkers were often placed in open, visible locations. Even in some villages, homes were demolished to build them right in plain sight. If secrecy had been the real goal, they never would have done that. Instead, it was all about projecting the image. Look, we're preparing for defense, and this worked. Polish documents from that time show they really believed it and concluded that the Soviets weren't planning any offensive actions, because everything was presented as defensive lines and fortifications.
There's a myth you'll often see online that Stalin was supposed to come here personally, take command of the Western Front, and from this spot launch an attack further west.
Stalin may have been the supreme commander, but by his position, he had no right to direct combat operations himself. That was the job of the chief of the general staff at most. And as history shows us, Stalin never personally went anywhere to take charge on the front lines.
Unfortunately, life has forced us to see many shelters and bunkers, but this one is truly unique. Notice that above it, there are 9 meters of solid granite. And while I can't say for sure, some claim this bunker could even withstand a nuclear strike.
A direct nuclear blast here is unlikely. But if it were to happen nearby, this site could basically withstand it. The only real issue is that the rock isn't solid. It's layered granite. That's the biggest weakness. If you look inside, you can already see water seeping through in places. That shows the rock isn't monolithic, and the leaks could become a problem. The doors inside, though, were all reinforced and sealed. So if they were shut, the bunker could block out the main effects of a nuclear blast, giving people a real chance to survive. Let's put it that way.
Granite gives off some natural radiation. So is there radiation inside here?
Granite itself has inclusions of different minerals. And since Korosten sits on a massive granite plateau, we have a lot of these elements in the rock. That's why the natural radiation background here is a bit higher than average, about 0.018 to 0.020 microroentgens per hour. Even before the Chernobyl disaster, it was stable at that level. Inside the bunker, if there's no ventilation, radioactive gas, radon, can build up, just like in any underground space. So the site needs to be ventilated constantly.
Historically, this bunker was used in the fight against the Nazis. Time goes on, but the Nazis just take new forms. In 2022, 2 Russian bombs hit this area. The craters were massive. The explosions blew out windows everywhere, tore off rooftops, and even destroyed the staircase that once led up the hill. It now ends abruptly. But even then, the bunker did its job. It saved around 150 people who were inside at the time.
It was on that very day that they had announced the military historical complex Skelya would be open to the public as a shelter. Almost every evening, 2 Russian Su-25 jets would fly over. And that day, we never imagined anyone would target this place. But they did. 2 FAB-500 bombs struck directly at the staircase leading up. As you can see, the stairs are practically gone. That day, there were about 160 people inside. The thickness of the granite is massive, so for bombs like that, it was more than enough. The people inside only felt a slight jolt and saw some dust drift through the corridor. That was it. The only real issue was that a piece of granite broke off and blocked the main entrance. But thanks to the way defensive structures are designed, there was also an emergency exit.
If you ask Google today who's hiding in a bunker, the answer is obvious. An interesting fact, back in 2023, Yandex actually blocked all images if you typed in the code phrase, "the bunker grandpa." Putin wasn't there. It seems to be a historical pattern. All those dictators who commit genocide and kill hundreds of thousands of people don't dig themselves graves. They dig bunkers. They think that down there, they can hide and feel safe. Stalin didn't feel secure, yet ironically, he helped create his greatest enemy. After World War I, Germany was slammed with severe restrictions, it was isolated, and the Soviet Union became, in many ways, its only partner. Under the treaty's terms, Germans weren't allowed to have an air force, tank units, or to manufacture and test certain weapons on their own soil. But nobody talked about doing that on Soviet territory. Russian propagandists rarely mentioned the joint military activities. Ask them what German tank crews were doing at the tank plant in Chelyabinsk, or what German pilots were doing in Stavropol. The key point was resources, things Germany lacked. Soviet oil, metals, coal. And those supplies helped make up the difference. Early in World War II, France even considered bombing Baku because it was the USSR's main oil region and was effectively fueling Germany. But the French judged the plan unrealistic, so the irony is stark. The world's leading anti-fascist, Stalin, was supplying Hitler with resources. Naturally, at some point, Hitler didn't want to stay dependent. He entertained the idea of simply seizing Baku and taking its oil fields for himself. The first thing that catches your eye are these doors. Are they original?
Yes, this is probably the only surviving armored door of this type in existence. It was preserved only because it got jammed and couldn't be removed. In all other sites across Ukraine, these doors had already been cut out.
The scale of this site is impressive. The bunker is 156 meters long, which might not sound like much, but remember, it was carved out of solid granite, and all of it was done by hand. There was no electricity, so every inch was chipped away with picks. According to the documents, construction took 3 years. Normally, projects like this relied on prison labor, but this site was so secret that prisoners weren't allowed anywhere near it. One version of events says that's why there are no identical rooms inside. For example, a single worker might carve out just one room without knowing what was happening elsewhere. Then halfway through, they'd be pulled off the job and sent far to the east to do something similar there. That's how they tried to maintain secrecy.
The military units that were brought in here, the so-called engineer battalions, did some of the basic rough work. But the interior was handled by specialists who were brought in from elsewhere. Back then, it was organized through what was called the People's Commissariat of Labor. They simply brought in specialists. Who they were, where they came from, we don't know. No names. They did their part and left, under mandatory secrecy agreements. I'll tell you more. When I was first writing material about this site, I still managed to speak with some elderly people who remembered bits and pieces, things they'd heard. And every one of them asked me the same question. Why are you gathering this information?
You might think that underground structures this expensive were rare, but in just one day in the Kyiv region, I found several of them. This particular bunker surprised me the most because, at first glance, it doesn't look like anything special at all. Honestly, I was shocked to discover such massive underground bunkers here in Kyiv region. Right now, we're on the second underground level. Getting here was so difficult that we couldn't even bring our camera equipment. We're just filming on a phone because that's the only way. We're now trying to reach the exit that supposedly leads straight to the river. The only problem is not getting lost, because the exits are a real labyrinth. The passage gets narrower and narrower as we climb up toward the river. But I think the news isn't good. There's been a landslide here. The concrete is deformed. Wow, there's only soil above me now. Not super safe. The exit to the river is completely buried, and not even by dirt. It's filled with sand. You can even see tree roots already growing through it. Himmler's bunker was built above ground. Soviet bunkers, on the other hand, are underground, dug into rock. So why was there such a different approach to construction?
In World War I, the Germans, British, and French all dug in. The Russians, however, didn't build reinforced concrete fortifications like that. But in the run-up to World War II, it was the Soviets who shifted toward underground construction. Their engineers began digging deep, even into solid rock. We know of two such sites built into bedrock, one in Vinnytsia and another here in Korosten. The Germans, on the other hand, preferred above-ground structures. They understood that underground work was harder, more expensive, and took longer. Himmler's above-ground bunker itself wasn't very big. At the time, no bombers were even capable of reaching that territory, so it didn't need to withstand heavy strikes. I often bring this up when I lecture on military fortifications at the university. For example, I give a lecture specifically on the Winkel Towers. These massive, above-ground shelters shaped like giant anthills, designed to hold thousands of people. They were quick to build, but history shows they were never really tested against concentrated, heavy bombing. Himmler's bunker was built the same way, above ground, with only about 2 meters of its foundation underground, camouflaged on top. A modest structure, about 10 by 10 meters. For its time, it did the job as a shelter. And even today, it still works for that purpose.
The museum has a lot of unusual items, but this one surprised me the most. It's a gas mask, but not a standard one. It's huge. In fact, there are two of them here, one from World War II and another from World War I. And they weren't made for people. They were made for horses. I honestly have no idea how you'd even put something like this on a horse, but if you managed to, it could survive in a contaminated environment for at least 4 hours. How well has this bunker actually been studied? Because without the documents that are in Moscow, it's probably not that easy to do.
I'd say the structure itself is more or less studied. Let's put it at about 90%. Sure, there are still some things we don't know, but nothing significant enough to change the overall picture we already have today.
Online, you'll find all kinds of claims about secret levels here, like a first floor, or a flooded third level, or hidden passageways. Is any of that true?
Look, I'll put it this way. This so-called legend is a myth, but it does have some basis. I know why. Up until the 1980s, part of this site was basically sealed off. This whole section was bricked up, and the entrance was only from one spot. There was no floor here, just a technical level with ventilation ducts, a big pipe carrying air. But the most important thing is this. When you entered from the emergency exit, the very first room you came into was a well. And this well was carved directly into the granite. Huge, with built-in steps, so it could be cleaned. As someone from Korosten who grew up here, I can tell you, I explored this site back when it wasn't trendy. And yes, we truly believed the stories about a flooded first floor. There was water down there, and when you dropped something in, you could tell it wasn't shallow. Plus, moving around was difficult, because now there's flooring that covers what was once that technical level for all the communications. But as I've said, back in 1933, building a multi-story underground structure in solid granite wasn't just difficult, it was practically impossible.
Have any secret rooms been discovered here recently? I've read about supposed tunnels, and even right here under our feet there's something with a handle. Looks like if you opened it, there'd be an underground passage.
There's a local legend about this place. Near the city hospital, there's also a very old bomb shelter. Some teachers used to tell kids in school that the two sites, this one in the park and the one near the hospital, about 500 to 700 meters apart, were connected by an underground passage. But after studying it closely, I can tell you, that's just not possible. We even brought in specialists from Kyiv with ground-penetrating radar at the very beginning of our research. What they found was solid rock all the way through. To tunnel under the river through granite over that distance would have been practically impossible. Now, it is true that some rooms inside were bricked up. But that was done by the Germans in 1941 to reduce the usable space of the bunker for themselves. And it wasn't until the 1980s that those sealed rooms were finally reopened.
Skelja is definitely on my list of places to recommend visiting. But the truth is, we have so many amazing sites right under our noses that could have become first-class museums, yet they've been abandoned, and only a handful of people even know about them. Some of the bunkers are completely unremarkable from the outside, like this one. Just a small entrance, with another one nearby and even a path leading up the hill. But if we go down inside, you'll be shocked at just how huge it really is. When I first came here, I thought it looked tiny from the street. But once you step further in, there are endless passageways. Left, right, straight ahead. The temperature rises noticeably. There are so many corridors that, honestly, you wouldn't want to be down here without a guide. Just look at the hallways stretching in both directions. It's hard to imagine how many people could have been housed here. Over here, it seems they had access to water, making it almost a self-sufficient mini-town. And here, I think there's even a climb back to the surface. It's clear that people lived here more recently, too. You can see modern trash left behind. And wow, the climb upward is incredibly steep. Honestly, I have no idea where it even leads. It's getting warmer and warmer. My camera lens is fogging up. I'm not sure how well you can see. Let's head right. If this video never makes it out, then maybe neither did we. Another turn, more walls reinforced with concrete. One tunnel has graffiti on it. No exit. Not a good sign. I think you're just as surprised as I am by the sheer scale of the Skelja bunker and by these bunkers scattered across the Kyiv region. They're truly impressive. It gives the impression that the Stalin Line was massive, strong, and powerful. But then the question arises, what went wrong? The answer is simple: the Soviet Union's ambitions. As its borders pushed further and further west, the old Stalin Line was basically abandoned and left behind. Back then, Korosten was essentially a border town. Poland was the neighbor and a potential enemy. But after Poland was annexed, the border shifted and they began building a new line, the Molotov Line. The Soviet Union had this thing for gigantomania. Everything had to be the biggest. The Stalin Line became this huge showpiece, a massive facade signaling we're preparing to defend. But in reality, were they preparing to defend or to attack?
You could say the gigantomania wasn't so much about the size, but about the sheer number of bunkers. And when you have bunkers, you need to arm them, train garrisons, and handle all the logistics. That's where problems began. The so-called Stalin Line was built along the old border, including the Kyiv fortified district, from 1928 to 1932. Then it was mothballed. The weapons were removed, some bunkers were even filled in with earth. Later, when the border shifted, they moved weapons toward the new frontier. But the bunkers there, the Molotov Line, only began construction in 1940, and they were never finished. So it created a strange situation. On paper, the Soviets were preparing for defense, but in reality, it was more about appearances, a signal of intent. And of course, it's not the bunkers that fight, it's the people. Some garrisons fought bravely and died defending their positions. But many bunkers were abandoned, allowing the Germans to bypass them and attack the ones still holding out. In some areas, the bunkers weren't manned at all. For example, when the Fifth Army retreated towards Zviahel, they took positions in the Didovichi strongpoint, even though it wasn't finished. They sent officers to check the situation in Zviahel, only to learn that the Germans were already there.
I still remember back in school when they taught us about World War II and Hitler's attack. There was this phrase that stuck with me, a treacherous attack. But it makes you wonder, if Hitler hadn't attacked first, would Stalin have done it?
The truth is, there wasn't really a treacherous attack the way Soviet history books described it. We know that the German ambassador in Moscow handed a formal note of protest to the Soviet government, something Soviet historiography always kept quiet about. They just said, well, yes, a note was delivered, but then Germany attacked anyway. But in that note, Germany officially declared war on the Soviet Union, accusing it of breaking agreements. First, in the north, Soviet forces had seized islands in the Baltic from which airstrikes could reach Berlin. Second, in the south, Soviet troops had entered Bessarabia, threatening the Romanian oil fields that supplied Germany. From the German perspective, they felt they had to strike first because they saw a growing threat. Of course, we know that Operation Barbarossa was a concrete plan. After the collapse of the USSR, even a Soviet military history journal published the maps with arrows showing where German forces were supposed to advance. Later, Viktor Suvorov, whatever one thinks of him, traitor or not, wrote, even from open sources, about the Soviet Union's preparations for war. I myself served in the Soviet border troops. Our 79th Border Detachment, based in Izmail, had just been formed. On June 22nd, when the so-called sealed packets were opened, the ones everyone whispered about, the orders inside weren't defensive at all. They said, cross the Romanian border, seize the crossings and bridges, destroy enemy border posts, and hold the territory until the Red Army arrived. And that's exactly what our unit did successfully. As Suvorov pointed out, if the Red Army had really been preparing for defense, they would have dug in. There were 26,000 tanks available. 16 fortified regions existed just in Ukraine alone. Look at the Kyiv fortified region. It held out for 72 days. If every fortified region had lasted even 10 days, let alone a month, the Germans would never have reached Moscow. That's the answer to whether the Soviets were preparing to defend or to attack.
Viktor Suvorov, the man we've been talking about, is actually Vladimir Razun, a former Soviet intelligence officer who broke with the USSR in 1978 and fled to Europe. For a long time inside the Soviet Union, his name was never mentioned. They acted as if he didn't exist. But he started publishing books, and his version of World War II history completely contradicted the official Soviet line. In 1999, the head of Russia's GRU admitted publicly that they knew exactly who Razun was. There was even a trial held in absentia that sentenced him to death. Based on the documents, in your opinion, was Russia, or rather the Soviet Union, actually preparing for an aggressive war with no intention of defending at all?
Absolutely. And really, this isn't just my opinion. It's the view of most historians who study the opening phase of the war. Well-known figures like Viktor Suvorov and Mark Solonin have laid it out in such detail that questioning it now almost sounds ridiculous. The documents are there. As the saying goes, paper doesn't burn. Of course, you won't find a line saying, "We'll attack on this date at this time." But the evidence of preparations is undeniable. For example, in May 1941, according to official documents, the so-called large training assemblies began. In reality, these were full-scale mobilizations. So if the Soviet Union kept telling the world that Hitler attacked suddenly and without warning, why were they already mobilizing people in May?
Do you think the Soviet Union was also preparing to launch an attack in 1941?
100%. Well, let's say at least 99%. For me, this question is settled. All the documents and the work of today's historians show it quite clearly.
People say there are systems here, like the sewage, for example, that even today we don't fully understand how they worked or where they drained to.
That's an absolute fact. The sewage system here still works today, but it doesn't drain into the river. At the time, this was part of what they called anti-sabotage measures, basically making sure there were no outward signs that people were inside these bunkers. As for how exactly the system works, we have some guesses, but honestly, we still don't fully know.
You've been studying this bunker for a long time. Back then, when you reached out to Moscow, what did they tell you? Something like, "Goodbye, don't ask questions"?
In 2008, I visited the Russian State Military Archive. The head of the archive told me, "We won't give you certain documents from that period because you'll end up rewriting history." Honestly, I had to laugh at that. Because today, we live in countries where, in principle, everything is already known. But unfortunately, for Russia, there are still blank spots they don't want to reveal. They won't talk about certain plans, because Russia now positions itself as the successor of the Soviet Union. And admitting those mistakes is something they simply refuse to do. Here we can actually see what's left of an armored cable. It was laid under the river. From this site, it went out through a pipe beneath the river to what was then called the Telegraph Center. From there, it connected to all the bunkers in the Korosten fortified district and also linked directly to Kyiv. That's because these facilities were under the command of the Kyiv Special Military District at the time, and from there, up the chain to higher command.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard that not long ago someone tried to hook up to that cable, and it still worked?
The communications here are still functioning today. All the cables can be tested, and they're all still connected. Basically, the integrity of the external communication system is in good condition. The telephones were working up until quite recently.
So there were no calls through to Moscow?
You can call anywhere. It all depends on the operator who connects you. You could even call Washington if you wanted.
The Skelya bunker is indeed part of the largest defensive line in the world, the so-called Stalin Line. But Stalin himself was never here, and there are countless facts that prove it. Quite simply, this bunker wasn't of high enough status for him. In fact, Stalin never visited the Stalin Line at all. His entire understanding of its construction came only from documents and reports from his subordinates. So, was this really Stalin's office?
Formally speaking, this room has been fully restored to recreate the atmosphere of that period. You'll see all the standard elements that had to be in any commander's office. And this was the office of the commander responsible for this sector. There was always a desk, a chair, a radio, a bust of Stalin, and a portrait of Lenin. These weren't just decorations, they were mandatory, spelled out in directives. The telephones here are original from that time. One of them, the one with many buttons, was used for what they called a direct line. You pressed a button, and it connected you straight to the person you needed. This room itself is unique. It's actually 2 stories tall.
Yes, you can see the second floor.
This was the place where the commander of this sector, this part of the front, was supposed to be. You can see the vent on the wall. When the ventilation system was running, warm, clean air would come through there. As you may have noticed, there are almost no places here designed for rest. That's because the bunker was intended for what they called 24-hour shifts. Personnel would come in, stay here for 24 hours, then be replaced by the next group, and so on. In the event of combat, this was the commander's station. Directly across were the offices of his deputies and staff. And that second room, which we initially thought might have been the commander's rest area, actually turned out to be used for storing classified documents and maps.
There's a bust of Stalin here, but Stalin's spirit was never actually in this place, right? Have there been any other spirits or ghosts reported? Because in almost every bunker, people claim they've seen someone wandering around? Or do you take a more cold, rational view and say you've never seen anyone?
Let me put it this way. As a historian, I'm interested in facts. I don't deal in ghosts or spirits. But people are different. And I'll be honest, visitors come here with all sorts of questions, and everyone sees something different in this place. For example, there was a woman who once came here to study the history of water. She actually asked to be locked inside for a while so she could talk to the water, sit here and reflect on certain things. For me, I see it as a military fortification, and that's what interests me. But, as they say, everyone finds their own meaning here.
Today we've been breaking down a lot of myths about this site. What's the biggest legend you've come across where you thought, wow, that's a really creative story?
Actually, I'd say the biggest legend is simply that this place was called Stalin's Bunker. The idea came from a local resident named Yashchenko. He wasn't even really a historian, but he was the first to bring up the topic. He wrote that since Korosten sits on such a massive granite formation, a sort of place of power, that must have been why the defense here held out for so long. And so it made sense that a special bunker for Stalin would have been built in these rocks. He was the first to suggest that. At first, people laughed it off, but then the story spread. And when the site was open to visitors, people came specifically to see Stalin's bunker. From a tourism point of view, it worked great. It really caught people's interest. But let's be honest. Historically, almost any bunker built in the Soviet Union could have been called Stalin's bunker. And knowing Stalin's personality, he had plenty of quirks. There are even memoirs that during the siege of Moscow in 1941, when the Central Committee held meetings down in the metro, Stalin went down only very reluctantly. So he wasn't the type to feel comfortable in underground bunkers at all.
Stalin, too, realized with some reluctance that Hitler had attacked. For example, on the very day of the invasion in Kyiv, they had actually planned to open the Republican Stadium. The Germans had shifted the planned date of their attack 29 times, and Stalin seems to have convinced himself it was all just part of some bluffing game. The true role of defensive lines wasn't to stop an enemy army outright, but to slow it down, to buy time to gather troops and prepare. But what actually happened was this. Along the Molotov line, there was an enormous concentration of Soviet equipment, yet it was almost completely unsuitable for defense. As Suvorov writes, to put it simply, the equipment stationed on the border was meant for attack, not defense, and that's why the Soviet Union collapsed so quickly in those first weeks.
Exactly. If you were really preparing for defense, you wouldn't move your airfields right up to the border. You wouldn't mass huge numbers of tanks so close to the frontier in tightly packed formations. The same goes for artillery and all other forces. And you certainly wouldn't send so many troops into the Brest fortress, which later became a death trap. In fact, one of the main contingents inside Brest wasn't even frontline soldiers, but large numbers of convoy troops.
If we look at the equipment the Soviet Union had compared to Germany, the numbers are staggering. The USSR had a massive advantage. So how did the Germans manage to advance so quickly? Was their equipment really that much better? Or was it simply far superior training and preparation? Because when you compare the raw numbers, they don't match the reality at all.
I've always said, and I'll keep repeating, it's not machines that fight wars, it's people, it's soldiers. And in the Red Army, individual training, and especially group training, handling tanks, aircraft, artillery, was extremely poor in many units. On top of that, there's the question of morale. German soldiers were motivated. They believed they were fighting against communism, which they saw as an existential threat to Germany. In the Soviet Union, the army was made up mostly of peasants, not industrial workers. And we can't forget that just a few years earlier, there was the Holodomor famine. Many people had suffered terribly under Soviet rule, and not everyone had the will to fight for that system. As for the officer corps, German officers had already gained real combat experience in Europe, leading troops, coordinating operations, managing logistics. Soviet officers, on the other hand, looked impressive in their new uniforms and leather belts when parading in front of women. But when it came time to actually take responsibility in battle, many simply weren't prepared. There are stories, for example, from when the Fifth Army's headquarters and the Southwestern Front headquarters were encircled. Locals who lived into the 1970s and 80s told researchers that they remembered as children seeing convoys of trucks, cars, and even armored vehicles under canvas covers. At first, people thought they were loaded with ammunition or weapons. But when they peeked under the covers, they found china sets, furniture, and personal belongings. The officers had been evacuating their household goods instead of preparing for war. That tells you a lot about why many of them neither wanted to fight nor were capable of leading effectively.
The Germans broke through the Molotov line in just a matter of days. Next in their path stood the Stalin Line, a massive defensive system that, for a time, had been all but forgotten.
The line the Germans called the Molotov Line, the new defensive belt along the shifted border, was still unfinished. The Germans knew exactly where everything was because, just like here, the construction had been carried out almost openly. They mapped every position, so the line was breached very quickly. To give you an idea, the war officially began on June 22nd. Yet by July 12th, the fighting had already reached the Korosten fortified district. The German advance was so fast and overwhelming that there wasn't enough time to properly staff and equip the bunkers here. In a rush, they managed to get some of the first defense line working, installing machine guns and a bit of equipment. But the majority of these fortifications were never fully battle-ready.
In practice, you have concrete pillboxes and bunkers. But what you critically lack are people, at least somewhat trained troops. Or the opposite problem. You have personnel but no weapons, not even a single machine gun to fend off the Germans. When you look at all the numbers, manpower, resources, you realize the odds were slim. So what was Hitler thinking? Against those figures, his chances looked very small, and yet he almost pulled it off.
The thing is, Hitler understood that a long, drawn-out war would be disastrous. That's why he bet everything on a blitzkrieg. And secondly, he expected the same outcome as in Western Europe. When German forces bypassed the Maginot Line, forced the British to retreat to their islands, and pushed the French government to declare capitulation, even though part of France hadn't yet been occupied. Hitler thought the same would happen with the Soviets. With so many Red Army units pulled right up to the border, he expected them to be surrounded and crushed in those opening battles. And then, just like France, Stalin would be forced to sue for peace on terms favorable to Germany. That was his calculation.
In reality, Korosten played a huge role in saving Kyiv and really the whole Soviet Union. When Germany invaded, Korosten had effectively become a border town. Poland collapsed in just 36 days, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France in 44. But Korosten held out for 58 days, seriously delaying the Wehrmacht's advance.
Even today, the story of Korosten hasn't received the recognition it deserves. Not even in Russian history textbooks. The problem lies mostly with the figure of General Peichev, commander of the Soviet Fifth Army, who was in charge of defending this sector. In September, he was captured unconscious and survived the war. Afterward, however, he was stripped of his rank and his party membership. It was only thanks to Zhukov, since Peichev had been one of his officers, that he was later reinstated to command, serving with Zhukov in Odessa until 1953. Still, he was never fully restored in the party. And because of that, the story of Korosten was essentially erased by party officials. Add to this the fact that the events of 1941 were seen as a failed defensive operation, with massive Soviet losses. To give you perspective, documents show that on average, the Red Army was losing about 1,500 men per day here. Peichev constantly had to replenish his forces, mobilizing locals and holding the line of the fortified district. Despite these losses, the battles around Korosten lasted nearly 50 days. At the start of the war in 1941, that was one of the most successful Soviet defensive operations. But, as I said, because Peichev fell out of favor, the story of his army and Korosten's defense was essentially wiped from the official record.
I heard a story that there was some political officer here who locked up 200 soldiers and then ran away himself.
Honestly, I've never heard that story. And to be clear, there weren't really any battles here. One German journalist who came to this site in September 1941 described the scene when they entered. He wrote that there was a lot of blood on the walls and the bodies of several officers, most likely, though we can't say for certain. These were Soviet engineers who had been ordered to blow up the bunker. When the Fifth Army retreated, they destroyed bridges and were supposed to demolish all military facilities as well. According to the German report, something must have gone wrong, what they called an unfortunate incident. Yes, this was the emergency exit. It was camouflaged. If you look over there, you can see the concrete blocks. At one time, there were rails laid across those blocks, and the whole area was covered with camouflage netting. From the other side of the river, you couldn't see this entrance at all. It was completely hidden. Now, imagine this. All of this was carved out of solid granite. It doesn't sound like much, just 156 meters of corridor. But that took years of work. And who exactly did that work inside? That's still an open question. As I've said, soldiers were brought in, regular conscripts, often from central Ukraine. The idea was that they had no family ties here, nothing to connect them locally. So there was less risk of them leaving any traces or talking about what they were doing during their off hours.
And how long can a bunker like this actually last? Are we talking hundreds of years?
Construction started back in 1933, so this bunker is already about 90 years old. If there are no seismic problems, it can stand for a very long time. The only real threat to it is water.
Before the full-scale war, how many tourists did you usually have overall?
On average, we had up to about 1,000 visitors per month.
Did visitors come from abroad as well?
We had a lot of foreign visitors, especially people interested in fortifications. Many came from Poland, the Baltics, Belarus, even Switzerland. We also had visitors from England, Norway, and many other countries. The key is not to see this as Stalin's bunker or treat it as some cult object, but to view it as a piece of fortification art, a product of its era. This bunker is still very little studied in the broader history of world fortifications. At that time, the Soviets were experimenting, trying to find the right forms of fortification, as they called it. The Germans had their own school, the French had theirs, the Poles and Czechs had theirs. But in the Soviet Union, most of the experienced engineers had been purged, so the ones who remained had to learn and build everything from scratch. From that perspective, its uniqueness as a fortification, this structure really has no equal.
You might think bunkers are a thing of the past, but today's paranoid Kremlin ruler has outdone even Stalin. Back in the 2000s, US intelligence and some Western journalists revealed the existence of a massive bunker beneath the Kremlin, built deep underground, around 200 meters down. Construction began in the 1950s after the first use of nuclear weapons. It's huge, designed to hold about 10,000 people. Not ordinary citizens, of course, but the top party leadership. It's also conveniently located, with exits leading into the metro system, and according to some researchers, even a passage to the airport. In 2014, a group of urban explorers accidentally stumbled into one of these bunkers and took a few photos. A year later, they ended up in prison, but the pictures survived. And Russia has plenty more bunkers like this. For example, more than 1,000 kilometers from Moscow, there's an underground city beneath Mount Yamantau. This facility became known in 1996, after the New York Times reported that even after the Cold War ended, Russia was still building secret military complexes. It's believed this one is a doomsday bunker, meant for use in the event of World War III, because it's truly massive, big enough to hold around 300,000 people. But it's more than just a shelter, it's a full command center. And people still say Stalin was the paranoid one? Do we know how much money was spent on it? Is there any figure at all in the archives?
For the entire fortified district, the annual budget was $13 million. I think this bunker alone cost about $6 million, which was an enormous amount of money for that time.
Have any older Germans ever visited you here and said, "Oh, I was here once during the war"?
No German veterans ever came here in person, but one did write to me. His name was Walter Weber. He's no longer alive. When he wrote to me, he was almost 90 years old. He shared a lot of his memories. Of course, he couldn't recall everything, but he described certain moments. What's interesting is that after this city was occupied, there were actually more Hungarians stationed here than Germans. Hungarian units made up the bulk of the forces. There were relatively few Germans. I even had a case where a relative of one of those Hungarians came here, wanting to see the place and learn a little more. But in general, most of them don't really like to talk about this period, about their connection with Nazi Germany. Still, as we can see, history has a strange way of circling back around.
I hope in this video you've heard a lot of new information, things we might not have thought about before. Don't forget to give it a like, subscribe to the Peichev channel, and let us know in the comments what you think of this material and whether you enjoy videos in this style.